Hello everyone, and welcome to the Safe Zone Show. I'm Jordan Sanderson, the Q Center Coordinator, and your host. Today, we'll be talking about identity as it relates to the LGBTQ+ community. Identity will be the foundation for all of the conversations we have later in this series. Today, we'll be discussing the complexities of gender, talking about attraction and sexuality, and finishing up with a very special interview. So, let's get into it. Identity is defined as the distinguished character or aspect of an individual, and we all hold many identities that intersect in many different ways. Some we choose, such as our religious affiliation or political affiliation. Others, not so much, such as our age. Identity is how we see ourselves, how others see us, and how we interact with the world. But today, we'll just be discussing gender and attraction as it relates to the LGBTQ+ community. Today we'll be talking about gender as a social construct. This is different than anatomical sex. Gender as a social construct is a complex system of roles, expressions, identities, performances, and other things given meaning to a society based on sex assigned at birth. To expand this understanding, let's look at the map behind me. Each of these pinpoints represent a gender that is specific to a culture, from the Mahu in Hawaii to the people in India who are Hijra. Their existence has lasted for thousands of years and are part of traditions, religions, and have ties to indigenous people. And a lot of these have survived colonization. For example, the Hijra people of India and Southeast Asia have a long presence in the history of Hindu mythology. The term holds many different meanings to different people and can include trans and intersex individual, but is not always. The Hijra people are in a contradictory place in India. While Hindu mythology deifies these people, British colonists demonized them. This is an example to understand gender outside of our modern-day Western view of it. Recognizing gender to be larger than our understanding in space and time that we occupy right now is important to grasp how vast, complex, and endless gender can be. Gender isn't simple, like many things in our lives, but it is the overall concept. So let's move from the overall concept, gender, down to the center, which is gender identity. Gender identity is what we decide. It is how we identify and how we feel about ourselves. People can identify as male, female, non-binary, genderqueer, or one of many other terms. Some people don't have a term that they identify with at all. Gender expression is our presentation to the world. It's how we show how we feel to others. We do this through the way we talk, our mannerisms, our interactions, our clothing, our hairstyles, and so on. And then gender attribution is others' perception of our expression. So gender attribution really highlights the existence of gender as a social construct. If I were to be dropped into the 1800s, I would be perceived much differently than someone who is living in that time, even though we are both men. But the way I dress, the way I walk, the way I talk is much different than men in the 1800s. We've socially constructed what gender means based on time and where we are in the world. Next is the body. And while earlier I did say that sex is different than gender, we have imposed sex and gender to be something understood together. Gender is imposed on bodies. Our physical traits don't necessarily inform our identity, and some people see those as separate, and there's a distinction between those, but other people see them as interrelated. Now that we've talked about gender as an overall construct, and I've explained gender identity, let's dive into a few identities that fall into the LGBTQ+ community, starting with transgender. You might understand transgender as someone who has transitioned from male to female, a trans woman, or someone who's transitioned from female to male, a trans man. But the reality is, transgender is an umbrella term that encompasses many different identities within the LGBTQ+ community. The other two terms up here, genderqueer and non-binary, may fall under the trans umbrella. They both can be vaguely described as someone who identifies as not man or woman. They might fall outside of the binary, they might fall in between, and they might fall somewhere completely off of that spectrum. So, let's take a question from the audience.
Hey Jordan, I've heard people use the term cisgender before. I'm not sure what it means. I wanted to ask you if it falls under the transgender umbrella.
That's a fantastic question. Thanks, Wilson. And this might be the easiest thing I say all day. The answer is no. Cisgender folks do not fall into the transgender umbrella. Cisgender is the opposite of transgender. Cisgender can be defined as someone who is on the same side as, so their identity aligns with their sex assigned at birth. I'll use myself as an example. I was assigned male at birth, and I identify as a man. I therefore am cisgender. Moving past gender, let's talk about attraction or sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is a huge part of the LGBTQ+ community, so let's discuss some of the orientations we have on the screen, starting with multisexual identities. Bisexual and pansexual. These are identities where individuals have attraction to more than one gender. Monosexual identities, such as gay or lesbian. These are identities in which someone has attraction to just one gender. And the A-spectrum identities. The A-spectrum can be asexual, demisexual, gray asexual, and this really gauges someone's level of attraction to other people, or the lack of attraction to other people. So, now that we've got everything out of the way, let's do a quick recap. Starting with gender identity. This is the center point of how someone feels. Gender identity is their internal perception, and it influences all of the things surrounding it: gender expression, gender attribution, and the body. And all three of these things surrounding it also influence gender identity itself. So let's recap a few things. Gender expression is one's external display to the world. Gender attribution is how the world perceives that display. And our body, while separate from gender, does play an impact on our gender. It's important to recognize that all of these things may influence each other, but they do not always align. And a lot of this has to do with safety, especially when we're talking about LGBTQ+ youth or people just coming out. Let's give an example. You're in class with one of your friends, Jessica. Jessica has disclosed that she is trans. She uses she, her pronouns, and she dresses feminine in the classroom. Well, when Jessica has to go home for Thanksgiving break, her family's not very accepting. So Jessica wears baggier clothing, wears her hair up under a hat, doesn't wear makeup, and uses he, him pronouns with her family and the name that they gave her at birth. In this case, Jessica's external display, or her gender expression, is very masculine. But Jessica is still the person she is. She is a trans woman. So her gender identity and gender expression are not aligning in this scenario. However, that's just one of the cases. It's really important that when we leave here today, that we recognize that gender expression, gender identity, gender attribution, anatomical sex, and attraction are all separate things. They can influence each other, but they're not the same thing, and they don't always influence each other. So, before we wrap up today, I want to take a brief moment to have an interview with Vic Spencer, the director of the Q Center. Today we'll be chatting with Vic Spencer, the Q Center director. Vic, today we've been speaking about identity. So I want to have a few questions for you, and I'd like to get your expertise.
Okay.
So if you could just share with me some of your thoughts, what do you think the importance is of understanding one's own identity and understanding identities that are not yours?
So our identities are, it's how we define ourselves, how we understand ourselves, but also how we understand ourselves within the context of the rest of the world. So it's how we our histories, our relationships to others. It's how we are able to say, okay, I am these things, and even though these are really maybe broad categories, it helps us both to understand for ourselves and for other people what their experiences are, what how they relate to their histories, how they may be affected by institutional policies or histories of oppression, current systems of oppression. So they are a way for us to just understand each other and understand ourselves and our place in the world.
Absolutely. And I think understanding others is the first step to becoming a better ally, which is what we're here for.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So what are some things that people need to take into account or remember when they're speaking about identity or thinking about identity?
So one of the big things that I think is super important is remembering that identity and the way that we describe our identities is very individual and very personal. So I personally use the word queer to describe my sexual and gender identity. For me, it's a really useful kind of general term that fits the really complex and sometimes nuanced or complicated ways that I understand my sexuality and my gender. For somebody of an older generation, for example, they may still see queer as a slur and don't relate to that term and don't want to recognize that as a way to identify. For them, that is a word that has been weaponized against them.
Absolutely.
And so I think particularly today, like, a lot of folks get really hung up on things like micro labels or, saying, if you identify as a lesbian, you must be X, Y, and Z. You have to do these things. You can't be bisexual and a lesbian.
Absolutely.
All of these things. And what gets lost in that is how much of our identity and how much we relate to specific terms is so very personal. It's related to our own personal histories, our experiences, our where we grew up and how we were raised. Somebody who grew up on in California is going to may relate to these terms and identity labels differently than somebody who was raised in, say, like rural Georgia. So yeah, just having that, giving people that grace and that level of understanding to know that, like, the way that I use a term may not be the same way that you use a term.
Absolutely.
But that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you brought up a good point when we're speaking about the word queer. I know a lot of people who use the word queer because it's so broad and it can encapsulate so many things. Some people get hung up on terms and they say, oh, well, you said you were this last week. And so queer is a nice term because it can be broad enough that, yeah, I'm queer. What does that mean?
Yeah.
It means a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people forget that sexual orientation and gender identity are fluid and they can change over time. And so terms, while they can be really helpful to understanding who you are as a person or who someone else is, they can also be really limiting sometimes.
Absolutely.
So it's definitely nice to have some broad terms to help us out there.
Agreed.
So this episode covered a ton of information on gender, identity, and attraction. What steps do you think people who are watching can take to become better allies from all the information they've learned from this episode?
So I think a really important first step is to remember that the information that you got and these like definitions and terms are really just a starting point. Use that as a baseline to understand, okay, this is sort of how people kind of identify. This is a sort of general, but don't consider it the be all end all. Stay curious. Go and try to do more research. Like, go and talk to people who identify under the queer umbrella about how they identify and how they want to be, referred to, or how they want to be interacted with. Like, I go back to this idea of like the golden rule, treat others as you would want to be treated. But in reality, what we should be doing is treating other people how they want to be treated.
The platinum rule.
The platinum rule, yes. Diamond, gold-studded, bedazzled. That use this knowledge as a starting point. That this is a place to start. It is not the place to end. And that all of us, queer, ally, whatever, we all can continue to learn and especially learn from each other and our experiences to become better allies for each other. Even us within the queer community, we all represent so many different identities and experiences that, I can learn from you. Your experience as a cis gay man is different than my experience as a genderqueer, AFAB, bisexual. Like, we have different experience, and our experiences are different than, the experience of, a Black trans woman. Like, so as a very long-winded and rambling way of saying, we can use this information as a starting point to learn more from each other, to support and advocate for each other better, more effectively.
Thank you, Vic, for joining us as our guest today. And we want to thank you for being here as well. And so let's remember what Vic just said. Let this be the starting point, not the end point. So, with that being said, we hope to see you next episode. Bye.